the purpose of this New York box is a follow-up to a very successful Las Vegas box that we did a few years ago. And it's only natural because Frank Sinatra and New York, especially with the song New York, New York. Disc 1 is the earliest material that we have on the box set, and the first disc comprises of Frank. Actually, it was 1955 and he was working at the Copacabana, and he went to a 20th anniversary for Tommy Dorsey, who he worked with years before as a band singer, was celebrating his 20th anniversary at the Manhattan Center, and it was broadcast on the radio on WNEW. And Frank stops in, and there's a little banter between them, and he also does 3 songs from the Dorsey era. Rounding out that Disc 1 is a concert that Frank did for the United Nations, a short concert, but it was in 1963, and what's different about it is Frank's piano player, who was with him for 5 decades, Bill Miller, is not on this concert with him for whatever reason. It's Skitch Henderson, who worked with Frank in the 40s and had done a lot of radio stuff and was the first band leader prior to Doc Severinsen on The Tonight Show. And when you hear it, if you're a fan of Frank Sinatra, you'll notice the difference in the piano playing of Skitch Henderson and Bill Miller. And Frank is not quite used to the way Skitch is playing, and there's a lot of banter and interplay there that's very interesting. Disc 2 is a concert that Frank did. It was a benefit in 1974. He had just come out of retirement the year before with Old Blue Eyes Is Back. And this was Frank coming back to Carnegie Hall. And what's interesting about this concert is it was a benefit for Variety Clubs International, which was a charity that helps a lot of children. And Frank had a love for children. And in this concert, after the second or third song, when you hear it, Frank announces that Hank Aaron has just hit the famous home run to break Babe Ruth's record, and he mentions just so there's no tension in the house. And he also does a song that he had recorded the year before that he rarely ever did on stage called There Used to Be a Ballpark. So it's a very interesting concert, and as I said, it's Frank coming out of, he retired in '71, and for a few years he had a brief retirement, and he came back in 1973. And this was sort of the beginning of him starting to tour and playing these large venues. And I don't think he had played Carnegie Hall for maybe almost 8 or 9 years. I think the last time he had played Carnegie Hall prior to this was a benefit that he had done 2 nights in October of '63 with Lena Horne. So it's really a very special concert. Disc 3 is Frank at Madison Square Garden, and this is the night before the main event concert. And the main event concert was a special night because it was broadcast live, and Frank did a concert coming out of retirement. He'd been out for a while, but this was, again, him on this big tour. And this was, he had done some nights prior to this in and around the New York metropolitan area. He had done Buffalo, he did Pittsburgh, and all in anticipation of this concert, the main event. The concerts were produced by Jerry Weintraub, who also had handled Elvis Presley and was a big concert impresario and went on to become a great producer and produced Ocean's 11, the remake, and Ocean's 12 and Ocean's 13 and The Karate Kid. So this was a concept. Frank was a big boxing fan, and he came up with the idea of setting up a stage like a boxing rink in the middle of Madison Square Garden, and they came up with the name, The Main Event. So this was the night prior to the main event, and what's nice about this is there's some songs that he does in this show that he didn't do on the TV main event or on the subsequent album. And as I said, it was broadcast live. The main event was broadcast live, and then there was also an album that became a very popular and big selling album, Frank Sinatra, The Main Event. Disc 4, we have Frank at 2 really famous New York venues, Carnegie Hall and Radio City Music Hall. And Frank had played in a lot of venues over the years in New York and had played, almost had like a standing engagement from about 1980 almost till the end of his career, where he would play 1 or 2 weeks at Carnegie Hall or Radio City throughout the year. So on this CD, the first half is composed from 1984 at Radio City, at Carnegie Hall, excuse me. First half of this, Disc 4, is from Carnegie Hall, 1984. And what's interesting about this is Frank was just in the midst of doing LA Is My Lady, which was one of the last albums he did before duets. So there's a nice version of Teach Me Tonight, which is a song that Frank had never sung before. And there's a great version of Pennies from Heaven, and it's just a really nice concert capturing Frank in 1994. And rounding out disc 4 is we have Frank at Radio City Music Hall from June 1990. What's interesting about this is the original engagement, Frank was there for 5 or 6 days in May of 1990, but he only did the first show because then he learned that Sammy Davis Jr. had passed away, so he canceled that engagement and they rescheduled it about a month later. And in this concert, Frank Sinatra Jr. is the conductor for his dad and the musical director. And Frank Jr. came on around 1988 until the end of his father's career and was his father's musical director. And you have Bill Miller is in the rhythm section. Again, Bill was with Frank longer than any other musician. And it just, there's a great version of New York, New York. And you can actually hear, there's a lot of interplay with Frank in the audience, and there's a lot of little anecdotes by Frank about what he loves about New York. So I think that it's a really great package. If you like the Sinatra in Vegas box set, I think you'll really like this. Probably one of the most exciting things in the package is the DVD, and this is a concert that Frank had done a 2.5 week stand at Carnegie Hall in 1980, in June of 1980. And New York, New York, he had just recorded New York, New York a year prior to this for the Trilogy album, and the album had come out in March or April of that year. So of course people were clamoring to hear New York, New York. And I think when you see this show, it's got a large orchestra. You'll see the consummate performer that Sinatra was and the interaction with the audience that he had and the love that he had for this city and that they had for him. And this was a concert that Frank had shot privately and had never been released yet, and we were able to clean it up, fix it up digitally, the sound on everything, and I think that it is great. Like I said, it's a great companion to the Vegas box set, and there we have a nightclub performance of Frank at Caesar's Palace, and here you have Frank at one of the greatest concert halls, you know, in the world at Carnegie Hall. So I think anybody that's a Sinatra fan will really enjoy this box set, Sinatra in New York. It's similar to the Vegas box set. We have a wonderful booklet in here with a lot of great photos and a lot of great writing. And we got Nat Hentoff, who's a great writer and jazz critic, who did a great essay on it. We've got reminiscences from Tony Bennett, Martin Scorsese, Twyla Tharp. Frank Sinatra Jr. does an introduction. Tom Young, who traveled with Frank near the end of his career as a sound guy and did the sound for Carnegie Hall, Radio City, and all these venues that Frank worked in. And George Kalinsky. We have a lot of great photographs from George Kalinsky. George is the staff photographer for Madison Square Garden, and he has been for the last 40 years. And there's a lot of great anecdotes by George on his relationship with Frank and the concerts that Frank had performed there, especially at the Garden. So overall, it's really a great package. If you're a Sinatra fan and if you like the Vegas box set, this is a great companion, and I'm sure you'll like this.